All right, so we're going to talk about the question, does God exist? I believe that a big part of doing evangelism in the 21st century is being able to make a case for Christianity, okay? And one of the pillars for the case for Christianity is the existence of God. If God does not exist, then Christianity is false. You want to prove Christianity false? Just show that God doesn't exist. End of discussion. Okay? And so it's important that we answer this question, does God exist? If you're going to make a case for Christianity, there's basically, I'll boil it down to 4 areas that you should be familiar with. The first is truth. We looked at it. It's the question, does truth exist? Before you can even begin to talk about, is it true that God exists? We have to know that truth is out there, that truth exists. So that's the first question. And hopefully you all know, kind of in your back pocket, if someone says, well, the truth doesn't exist, you can just ask the question, well, is that true? Because it's self-refuting. Truth has to exist. The second step kind of in our case would be to argue, to answer the question that does God exist? So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to look at some really good evidence, some cool evidence for the existence of God. After you have established that God exists, there is a God who can act, well, then there can be acts of God, okay? It's funny, you know, these guys are on Twitter and they like to bother me. And so, you know, just recently, someone made the point, oh, you guys believe in talking snakes and you believe in people rising from the dead and you believe, yeah, I do believe those things. But I believe in a God who can make those things happen. On a naturalistic worldview, on an atheistic worldview, of course, a man rising from the dead is highly unlikely. In fact, it's impossible. But if God exists, then certainly there can be acts of God, okay? We call them miracles. And I think the greatest act of God that has occurred in human history next to the origin of the universe from nothing, which we're going to talk about, is the resurrection of Jesus, okay? And then finally, and someone asked the question last night, well, we have all these books. How do you know which one's true? How do you know which ones are actually inspired by God? Well, it turns out if you have a guy who raised himself from the dead, he said, I'm going to die, and then 3 days later I'm going to rise, and then he does rise from the dead, well, you may want to believe what he says. And if he gives his words authority, if he says that the Old Testament is authoritative, then, hey, maybe we should trust that book. And so turns out you can kind of make the case here that God has spoken, and he has revealed himself in what we now call the Bible. So that would be the case. Now, we're going to look at that second step. The question is, does God exist? Is there good reasons to believe God exists? I don't want to leave you in suspense. The answer is yes. Okay? The answer is yes. And now let's close in prayer. You're thinking, no. You're not getting off that easy. So the theist says, yeah, God exists. We believe in God. Not everyone believes in God, though. In fact, a Pew Research Center survey found that 3.1% of Americans, and again, this would translate for Canadians as well, profess to be atheists. That number goes up to 7% when you throw in the agnostics. An atheist says they believe there is no God. An agnostic says, I don't know if there's a God, okay? Or maybe you can't know that there's a God. And so that would make up about 7% of the American population. And so some people say, no, God doesn't exist, like John Rosenberg, web comic artist, he says this. Does God exist? The short answer is no. The long answer is no. I thought that was funny. Clearly you guys didn't. And so whether you answer yes or no to this question, you should have some good reasons to back up what you believe. So if you're an atheist here, you should have some good reasons to back up that belief that there is no God. If you're a Christian here, if you're a theist, well, you should have good reasons to believe. And sadly, there's a lot of theists and atheists out there who don't have good reasons for their beliefs, okay? They don't have good reasons. When I talk to Christians, well-meaning, sincere Christians, as I travel around speaking, I'll tell you, probably 9 out of 10 couldn't provide good reasons for belief in God, okay? This is just the reality, okay? And like I said, they're sincere, but if an atheist came up to them and said, just give me a couple reasons to believe God exists, they wouldn't know where to start. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to give you 2. But before we get into that, I want to make an important distinction, and I mentioned this yesterday in the Q&A time. I want to make the distinction between knowing that God exists, and showing that God exists. It is quite rational to know that God exists apart from evidence. That is, just by the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, you can know that God exists. I don't want to downplay that, okay? Or you may know that God exists through the inner witness of the Holy Spirit and some evidence. That's my experience, okay? I've got good reasons, but I also have this experience apart from reason. But if you want to show somebody, if you have an atheist friend or family member, it's not enough just to appeal to some experience that you've had, okay? You want to show with some external evidence, some arguments that God exists. So that's what we're going to do, okay? If you want to do evangelism and apologetics, you need to be able to show that God exists. Now, before you can answer the question, does God exist? You should have a proper understanding of what we mean by God. Many people don't believe in God because, and listen very carefully, they have the wrong conception of God. In fact, the God they don't believe in is the same God I don't believe in, okay? I don't believe in the gods that they don't believe in, if that makes sense. And so so we might want to ask, what do they mean by God? Because a lot of people I talk to, atheists, they have this idea, or skeptics, they have this idea that God is this, bearded man sitting on a cloud somewhere. Or maybe they have the idea that maybe God is kind of like Thor or Zeus or one of the Greek gods. Or maybe it's, who's that guy again? Morgan Freeman in Bruce Almighty. That's the wrong conception of God. In fact, the traditional concept of God is infinitely above these finite beings that we kind of describe God as. Okay, and let me give you an example. Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion. He's probably one of the most famous atheists on the planet. He's got the wrong concept of God. Let me show you. In his book, The God Delusion, he says this. He says, I have found it an amusing strategy when asked whether I'm an atheist to point out to the questioner is also an atheist when considering Zeus, Apollo, Amon-Ra, Mithras, Baal, Thor, Wotan, the golden calf, and the flying spaghetti monster. I just go one God further. And so you can see kind of the idea here is, look at, you Christians, you're all atheists too. You don't believe in Baal and Zeus and all these other gods. Well, I just go one God. I just throw Yahweh into the mix. I just throw Jehovah or whatever you want to call him, he's in the mix. That's the wrong concept of God. Yahweh of the Bible is not even in the ballpark with these other ideas, concepts of God, okay? What do we mean? Well, these gods that Richard Dawkins just described are all created beings, for one. I mean, even if they're just mythical beings, the story is that they're created. They had a finite past. The God of the Bible is uncreated. We'll see that in a minute. These gods are all finite. They're limited in certain ways. The God of the Bible has no limitations, okay? These so-called gods are all temporal. They exist in time, whereas our God is eternal, exists outside of time. In fact, created time. We're going to have some fun with that. And then these beings are all contingent. What does that mean? They didn't have to exist. Whereas the God of the Bible, I would argue, is a necessary being. And so he must exist. In fact, remember the flying spaghetti monster? There he is. To compare the God of the Bible with the flying spaghetti monster is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And one of those reasons is because when you look at the evidence for a flying spaghetti monster, you won't find any. None. But if you want to go and look for evidence for the God of the Bible, the classical concept of God, going back to Aquinas and even further back, you will find that there are philosophical arguments like the Kalam cosmological argument. I mean, they have fancy names, the design argument, the moral argument. There are lots of arguments that have been put forth for the God, the traditional concept of God, okay? So these aren't even the same ballpark. You're probably wondering, what does the Pastafarian church look like that worships the flying spaghetti monster? And they wear spaghetti strainers on their heads. Now, of course, this is meant to mock Christians and to mock believers, okay? That's why they do this. It's not, I don't think they really believe in a flying spaghetti monster. At least I hope not. Okay, so what are these arguments? Well, I'm just going to give you two. We could go into a lot of detail on numerous arguments, but let's just look at two that I think we can get our minds around, okay? The first argument is sometimes called the cosmological argument. It's an argument for the origin of the universe and God as that originator, okay? And so it's an argument for a first cause, and so what does it look like? I'm going to sketch out the premises and then the conclusion that follows. So these are logical arguments. They're the kind of argument where if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows logically and inescapably, okay? So you'd have to point out that these premises are false. The first one is everything that begins to exist has a cause. I'll argue for that, okay? I think it's actually obviously true, but we'll look at it. The universe began to exist. If everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then it follows, logically, the conclusion is, therefore, the universe has a cause. And what I want to show you is, once we get to that conclusion, that the best explanation for that cause, the best candidate for that cause is God. Okay, and so let's begin with that first premise. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, this is, I think, virtually undeniable to any honest seeker of truth. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. So babies, that's my baby right there. I don't know which one, though. I think that's Jocelyn. She's 3 now. And that's my wife. Seriously, I should know better. They all look the same when they come out, though. So my wife would kill me if she was here right now. Okay, so babies, bouquets, and root beer all have a cause for their existence. Parents make babies. Florists make bouquets. A&W makes their delicious, and it really is delicious. And I noticed you guys have an A&W in Vernon. Congratulations. Nothing can come into being uncaused out of nothing. We all know this. If you go home today, okay, you go home from this conference and you find an iPhone sitting on the dining room table, it would be irrational to think that it just popped into existence uncaused, out of nothing, and just appeared in your house, right? No. You might think that your mom or your dad bought it or something like that. Someone maybe broke in and left it in the house for you. You would not think that it just popped into existence out of nothing without a cause, okay? In fact, that's worse than magic. At least in magic, you have a magician, he's got a hat, he pulls the rabbit out. to think that things just pop in uncaused out of nothing is ludicrous. And so that's the first premise. I think we all believe that's true. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. What about the second premise, that the universe began to exist? We're going to spend a little more time on this because I love science. And because there's a lot of scientific evidence that points to the universe having a beginning to its existence, okay? And so where do we start? Where should we start with our evidence? Well, let's look at kind of the beginning of this idea that the universe began to exist. And this goes back about 100 years to this crazy-haired fellow, Albert Einstein, a German theoretical physicist. Now, it turns out for centuries, it was believed by most atheists that the universe is uncaused and eternal. If it's eternal, then you can get away from the cause, okay? So they thought, yeah, it's just eternal. You go up, look in the night sky, it looks the same tomorrow as it did yesterday. Yeah, so it's probably eternal. And Christians, on the other hand, have always affirmed, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So there was a beginning to the universe. And up until the 20th century, there was no way to tell scientifically who was right. There were some philosophical arguments, but nothing from science to say one way or the other. That all changed with Albert Einstein and his famous theory of a general theory of relativity in 1915. And in his equation, he noticed, and I mean, I'm sure you can all see it here, that from that equation, that the universe is either expanding or contracting. Now, Einstein didn't like that for a couple reasons. For one, well, when he looked up at the night sky, it didn't look like it was expanding or contracting. And so, okay, so he didn't like that. And the next thing was that, well, if the universe is expanding, then that means yesterday it was closer together. And if you go back far enough, you reach a beginning point to the universe. And a beginning implies a beginner. And Einstein didn't like that, okay? And so what he did was he added a constant, what he called a fudge factor, to his equation that kept the universe static. Not actually, but the equation said that the universe was now not expanding, but static. Now, Einstein eventually called this, what he called the cosmological constant, the biggest blunder of his career. And he did that because of what he saw at the Mount Wilson Observatory. Now, let me just show you my daughter, Jocelyn. There she is grown up, and she's got the same hair as Einstein. That's when it's combed, people. And it's been brushed for hours. So what did Einstein see? Well, he got a call from his friend, Edwin Hubble. And they looked through his 100-inch telescope at the night sky. And what they saw confirmed that the universe was indeed expanding as Einstein had originally discovered, okay? What did he see? Well, what he saw was that the galaxies in the night sky that we were looking at were red shifted. What does that mean? Well, it turns out white light, the light that's blinding me right now, is actually made up of all the different colors of the rainbow. If you take in Ontario grade 10 science, you learn about Roy G. Biv, right? Those are all the different colors there. The red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So you have the color spectrum. On one end, you have long wavelengths. That's the red end. See how long that is? And then over here, short wavelengths, you have the blue end, and they're shorter. Now, what he noticed was, if the galaxies are moving further away, well, they're red shifted. They look redder. If they were moving closer, they'd be blue shifted, okay? The light coming from the galaxy would be blue shifted. It's kind of like this. You guys ever seen NASCAR or car races? And the cars, when they're coming towards you and past you, they make this noise. Let me do that again. What's happening? Well, the sound waves, kind of like light waves, are being compressed as the source comes towards you. That's a high frequency, that's like blue shifted towards. And that's where the waves get stretched out, okay? And so this is called the Doppler effect in science. You just want me to do that all day, and I will. In the same way, the galaxies, the space, now this is going to blow your mind, the space between our galaxy and those galaxies are being stretched out. And so the light waves, as they travel towards our galaxy, are being stretched out by the fabric of space. Yeah. And so this led to the idea that the universe indeed is expanding. That is, it's getting bigger. It just got bigger. Okay, it just got a little bit bigger. Okay, and I could do that all day too. And so here we have what Albert Einstein knew right from the very beginning. If you're in the galaxy here, you look at other galaxies, they're expanding. That is, space is literally expanding. Check this out. If you go back in time, you end up getting to a beginning point of the universe. Not just a beginning to space, but as Einstein said, space and time are related. And that is, it's a beginning point in time as well. There's a time when time began, okay? There's a time when space began. In fact, if you can't even talk about before this because then your mind melts because there was no time before. And so at this point, you have matter, energy, space, and time all coming into existence. So that's the redshift evidence. That's pretty cool. But I can see you guys aren't impressed by that. So let me give you another one. It's called the second law of thermodynamics. It is one of the most established laws in science, okay? The second law of thermodynamics basically says this, that everything in the universe is running, or the universe as a whole is running out of usable energy, okay? It's kind of like a car. You fill up your car with usable energy, and over time, it runs out of gas, okay? Well, our universe is a lot like that. Although there is a difference between a car and the universe. You see, a car, you can always run out of gas and then just fill it up again. Now, I don't want to show you guys that part, so I'm just going to hide it. No, I'm just joking. There we go. You can always fill it up again, right? Our universe, we think, is a closed system. So when it runs out of usable energy, that's it. In fact, scientists call this the heat death of the universe. And that is, eventually there will hardly be any heat in the universe. Stars will burn out. Our universe will become cold and dark, filled with black holes, and then eventually even black holes will dissolve. Yeah, kind of depressing. Don't worry, Jesus is coming back before then. All right, so you have this, so when it runs out, that's it. Now, how is this an argument for a beginning of the universe? Well, think about this. If we went into the parking lot right now and we found a car running, okay, you would know for certain that that car had not been running from eternity. Because if it had been running from eternity, that is always run, it would have run out of gas by now. In fact, and this is going to make your mind explode, it would have run out of energy an eternity ago, right? So if you fill it up, and then there's an issue there. The only thing that makes sense is that our car was filled up a finite time ago, and it's running, and soon it's going to run out. But it hasn't fully run out yet. There's gas in the tank. In the same way, we look at our universe, hey, there's still usable energy out there. Our universe must have a beginning, okay? Now, I could go further into that, but let me leave you with, this is not a Christian scientist, not even close. And he says this, all of the evidence, not some of it, all the evidence we have says the universe has a beginning. When atheists message me on Twitter and I say something like, well, the universe, in fact, this morning this happened, just say the universe is eternal, I would just quote Alexander Vilenkin and say, this is one of the leading theoretical physicists, astrophysicists in the world. He says all the evidence points to a beginning. So evidence is on the side of the theist in this situation, not the atheist. In fact, here's what Blanken says. He says in his book, Many Worlds in One, it is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They must face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Now, it's very interesting the words he chose. The problem of a cosmic beginning? It's not a problem for me, folks. Why would people be hiding behind the possibility of a past eternal universe? Because a past eternal universe gets rid of they think gets rid of the idea of God. I actually think it doesn't. But basically, he's showing that, listen, there must be a beginning. And hey, if that has theological implications, you gotta get used to it. Okay, so we have these two premises. I think they're true. That means that the universe has a cause. Now, the question is, what is that cause like? What could cause a universe like ours? Well, it has to be, so the effect is the universe. The cause has to be capable of producing matter. In fact, there was no matter, and so it has to be immaterial, okay? This cause produced space. In fact, there was no space before the universe, and so it had to be spaceless. There was no time. It created time, and so it must be timeless. Are you starting to see that these are the attributes that we give to God? I didn't open up the Bible here and say, "Thus saith the Lord." We could do that. It's called systematic theology. This is called natural theology. Let's look at the heavens and see what they tell us about our God. And it turns out we can get to know God's attributes, at least some of them, from what he has created, okay? And so I think you could argue that the cause that we're talking about is in fact God. Now, there's really two options. You can say, because we know the universe had a beginning from nothing, no thing. So you can either say that nothing, that is nothing nothing physical, produced the entire universe, or you can say something produced the universe. Which one am I going to choose? Nothing produced the universe, or something produced, and actually I think it's someone, so let's just put God up there. Someone produced the universe. Well, here's what the atheist response is right now. And this is why I think that this is a good argument, because when you see the chief responses, the primary responses to the argument I just laid out is absolutely ridiculous, okay? Here's what they say. Lawrence Krauss said, he's a famous atheist. He wrote a book, A Universe from Nothing, and he says this: some philosophers and many theologians define and redefine nothing as not being any of the versions of nothing that scientists currently describe. But therein, in my opinion, lies the intellectual bankruptcy of much of theology and some of modern philosophy, for surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. It then behooves us to understand precisely the physical nature of both these quantities, that is, something and nothing. Okay, if you're scratching your head, you're not alone. How about the very brilliant Stephen Hawking? In his book, The Grand Design, he says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. Huh? I mean, this is a very brilliant man saying something ridiculous. It is illogical. He says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. You just said there's a law of gravity. You just said gravity exists. You didn't start from nothing, Stephen. And so he, right out of the gate, he presupposes that the nothing he's talking about is really something. In fact, that's what we're going to see as we move along here, that when these guys talk about nothing, they're talking about something. And so let me bring in Richard Dawkins. Again, one of the most famous atheists. This is what he says. Listen carefully.
Of course it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. Now, it is very mysterious how the universe came into being. It's a deeply mysterious and interesting question.
And can I just interrupt? It's an old question, a very old question. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century was asking this same question. He said there must have been a time when no physical things existed, but something can't come from nothing. That was his view. It's just been repeated by us.
Something can come from nothing, and that's what physicists are now telling us. It's a matter,
you can quickly respond to that.
You can dispute exactly what's meant by nothing, but whatever it is, it's very, very simple. And why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
All right. So, and this reminds me, after watching this clip, you guys know The Princess Bride, right? Inigo Montoya, maybe you remember this.
He's got very good arms.
He didn't fall? Inconceivable. You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
And so Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss, they keep using that word, but I don't think it means what they think it means, okay? And so here's the problem. There's an equivocation going on with the word nothing. You guys actually have a John Deere tractor sales place around the corner. I noticed it as we were driving around yesterday. You guys know John Deere? And the slogan for John Deere, at least it used to be, nothing runs like a deer. Nothing runs like a deer. Okay? Now, when they say nothing runs like a deer, that could be taken one of two ways. Okay? It could be taken as in there is no thing that runs like a deer. Okay? There is no thing that runs like a deer, and I think that's what they mean. Or it could be taken this way. Nothing runs like a deer. There's a thing that we're going to call nothing, and it runs just like a deer, okay? Do you get the difference? In one case, it's no thing runs like a deer. In the other case, nothing runs like a deer. And so that's what they mean. We lost our screen here, but that's okay. Lawrence Krauss, he says nothing is every bit as physical as something. He says nothing is unstable. When he says stuff like that, nothing is unstable, he's talking about something. He's not talking about nothing. And it's not just the theists and the Christians who are making this point. In fact, Lawrence Krauss, I told you, he wrote a book, Something from Nothing, or A Universe from Nothing. And there was a book review written in the New York Times and by an atheist. Now, this atheist, his name's David Albert. And David Albert has a PhD in theoretical physics, and he has a PhD in philosophy. And he wrote a scathing book review. You should all read it. It's just fun to read. Reviewing Lawrence Krauss's book, he says this. He starts off by saying, this is a mouthful, relativistic quantum field theoretical vacuum states. Now, so when they say nothing, that's what they're referring to. Every time Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking, they say nothing, they're really referring to a vacuum, okay? In science, when you take all the stuff out of a vacuum, well, it turns out that things can pop into and out of existence inside this vacuum. How is that possible? Well, it turns out there's these fields of energy, and these fields are interacting with each other, and they can produce this energy, vacuum energy, can produce particles that come into and out of existence. See? Something from nothing. But that presumes a vacuum with space and fields and everything else. So listen to what he says. Relativistic quantum field vacuum, theoretical vacuum states, no less than giraffes or refrigerators or solar systems, are particular arrangements of elementary physical stuff, okay? He goes on to say this, the fact that some arrangements of these fields, these vacuum fields, happen to correspond to the existence of particles and some don't is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that some of the possible arrangements of my fingers happen to correspond to the existence of fists and some don't. And the fact that particles can pop into and out of existence over time as those fields rearrange themselves is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that fists can pop into and out of existence over time as my fingers rearrange themselves. And none of these poppings, if you look at them aright, amount to anything, even remotely in the neighborhood of creation from nothing. In fact, he ends his article by saying, as far as I can see, Krauss is dead wrong, and his religious and philosophical critics are absolutely right. Okay? So when they talk about nothing producing the universe, they're not talking about the nothing that they should be talking about, which is no thing, okay? Which is no thing. And so the best option is that indeed the universe, the best explanation of the universe, the origin of the universe, the beginning of the universe is God as its source, its beginner, its originator, okay? Okay, so that's the first argument. And so you can see science lines up really well with that particular argument. How about the moral argument, the moral law argument? This is probably the most persuasive in that it has persuaded many atheists to come to believe that God exists. C.S. Lewis was one of them. C.S. Lewis was most persuaded by this argument. And so here's how it starts. If God does not exist, okay, there's no God, objective morality does not exist. Remember what we mean by objective? Insulin. I don't know if I said this last night, but objective, the best way to think of it is something is objectively true if it's true, whether or not anyone believed in it or not, okay? So if I put this cup on the podium and everyone in the room believed that there was no cup on the podium, like everyone, not just in the room, but in the whole world, that would not, it would still be objectively true, okay, that it is so. So it's independent of whether someone believes it's true or not. And that's objective truth. So objective morality does not exist if God does not exist. Objective morality does exist, and I think that is, we'll show is obvious to an honest person. Therefore, God must exist. This is not a trick. If the first two premises are true, if God does not exist, objective morality does not exist. Objective morality does exist, therefore God exists. Now let me show you how both those premises are true, therefore the conclusion must be. Richard Dawkins, again, in his book, The River Out of Eden, listen to what he says. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. There's no justice fundamentally on Richard Dawkins' view. He says, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is, at bottom, no design, I'll show you tonight, there's design everywhere, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. On Dawkins' view, at bottom, there is no good and evil. Why? Because he believes he's an atheist. God does not exist, therefore there is no objective morality. C.S. Lewis, he said this, as an atheist, my argument, this is when he was, he's writing as going back to the idea when he was an atheist. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. This is the problem of evil he was raising in his heart. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice as nothing but a private idea of my own. That's relativism. I could have done that. I could have said, there's no objective morality. It's just me. It's just my likes and dislikes. But if I did that, my argument against God, the problem of evil, collapsed too. Okay, so this idea, relativism, holds there's no right or wrong. There's no standard to judge between two people's likes and dislikes, point of view. And so who's to say who's right? On this idea, well, there is no standard. And so kind of anything goes on this view. If God does not exist, there's no objective reference point. And so most people recognize, even atheists recognize, some at least, that for there to be a universally binding, objective moral law, then there must be something that can ground that law. We call that a moral lawgiver, okay? But if you get rid of the moral lawgiver, and this is also agreed upon by many atheists, you get rid of the lawgiver, then you get rid of objective morality. You get rid of objective, and what are you left with? It's either individualistic, that's relativism, I decide. You decide what's right for you, what's wrong for you, I decide what's right and wrong for me. That, by the way, is unlivable. It's unlivable. Maybe it's cultural relativism. Okay, let's all get together and decide as a group. But we can't judge another culture because we're not in that culture. And so when the Nazis decide that their culture is going to exterminate the Jews, well, then it's morally wrong for the West to come in and war against them, so they stop that, okay? If a culture wants to enslave a group of people, then it's wrong for another group of people to come in and say, you guys can't do that, okay? In fact, we couldn't look back at slavery and say, that was really wrong. All we can say is, well, that was different. That was different, and we might not like it. But there's no moral progress because there's no standard. If there's no standard, you can't progress towards something, right? And so you need a standard to say that, well, that's better than that. And if there's no standard, well, you're left with this. And you'll also see that many will just go the route and say, well, actually, morality is really just an illusion. In our next talk, I'll show you that there are atheists who argue that morality is not really a thing. It's really just something we invented in our minds to trick us into being good people. I can't even say good people because that's smuggled in morality. And so here you have, it's just an illusion that has evolved over time. And if you played evolution over again, well, you might get a different morality where, slavery is okay, and that's something we're trying to work towards, okay? And so, again, this is the idea of subjectivism. We talked about it yesterday. Everybody just has their likes, their personal preferences. And so on this view, there really is no objective morality. So that's the first point. If God does not exist, then you're left with relativism. Most people agree with that. The second premise is this: objective morality does exist. In the Q&A time yesterday, I pointed out that if you want to show someone objective morality exists, because we all have, even if it's tainted, even if it's a little bit broken, we all have a moral compass that's written on our heart. You can point to certain things like abuse or discrimination or genocide and say, that is wrong. Point to it. And if they agree that it's wrong, not just because I don't like it, but because it really is wrong to do those things, then they believe objective morality exists, okay? Yesterday I made the point. I have faculties like my eyes that allow me to see things, and I have some that allow me to touch things. Well, we have faculties that aren't like eyes, but are kind of like eyes in the sense that they're still real and they're able to see things, like someone being abused, and they are able to say, that's wrong. I see it, not with my eyes, but I just as clearly, I know that that's wrong. Okay? In the same way with other actions, like I used the analogy of the illustration of torturing a baby for the fun of it. If you can't call that wrong for everyone at every time, then you're not babysitting my kids. And so we have these two premises. If they are true, and I think they are, then it follows logically and inescapably, therefore, God exists. This is the moral law. This is the moral argument. Now, let me make a quick comment, because I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. Many will assert that they don't need God. They don't believe in God, but they still know right and wrong. They know, I have atheists that live moral lives. That is, they don't steal, they don't murder, they try not to lie, this kind of thing. They know right and wrong. And I would say, yeah, absolutely. It's not a matter of knowing right and wrong. The theist, the Christian, and the atheist both know right and wrong. It's written on our hearts. We said that. The question is, can they ground it? And the argument is, the atheist has no foundation to ground objective morality, whereas the theist can say, no, we can ground it in God. And so we could ask the question, can we be good without belief in God? The answer is yes. Atheists do it every single day. They don't believe in God, and they can live morally good lives in the sense that they're not stealing and killing and everything else. But there's a different question, not without belief in God. Can we be good without God at all? And the answer to that question is no, because there would be no goodness to begin with, because there is no foundation for good and therefore for evil, okay? It's kind of like this. You can know what a book says, while denying that there's an author. So there's the book, Green Eggs and Ham. Let's deny there's an author. The person could come along and say, listen, I don't need there to be an author because I can read this book just fine. That would make no sense, right? Yeah, of course you can read, but there would be no book in the first place unless there was an author. In the same way, listen, the atheist can know that morality exists while denying that God exists, but there would be no objective morality to know in the first place unless God exists, okay? So they can know morality, right and wrong, good and evil, while denying God exists, but there would be no morality to begin with unless God exists, okay? Hopefully that illustration helps a little bit. Here's an objection before we get to the close here. It's a very common objection. You take a high school philosophy class or a first-year philosophy class, they will talk to you about the Euthyphro dilemma, okay? And they'll say, okay, you want to ground morality in God. This is the main challenge. You think God is the standard? Okay, Christian, answer this. Answer this. And this goes back to Plato's dialogues, and it goes like this. Is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? So there's kind of a dilemma here. They say, is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? Let me show you the problem with both of these. So they're trying to really get the Christian on the hook here. If we say that something is good simply because God wills it, well, then he could have willed that abuse is good, or hatred, or greed. He could have willed any of those things. And so on this view, this is all arbitrary, okay? God could have willed anything. And so if that makes God arbitrary, they say, well, then that can't be the Christian God, you know. And so this is one challenge. The other challenge, though, is this. If we say that God wills something because it is good, maybe that's the answer. He wills all the good things out there. Then those things are independent of God. So he wills stuff that's good, like love is good, justice is good, courage, those are all good things. But now he's willing things that are independent of him. So they would say, see, we don't even need God. We don't need God around because love and courage and justice, they already exist out there. And so that makes the goodness independent of God. Here's how you answer the challenge. You kind of split the horns of this dilemma and you say, God wills something because he is good. It's because of his very nature. Or you could just say, God is good. This is how we make sense of the standard. The standard isn't outside of God, and it's not just arbitrary. He didn't just say, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to make genocide really cool. No, he doesn't do that. Why? Because the goodness is found in God himself, not outside of him. And the commandments that he gives us, they come out of his very nature. They come out of his very being. And so, of course, he doesn't will rape and abuse and some of these other things because those are contrary to his very nature, okay? And so ultimately, we're able to ground God's goodness in his being. And that's why I say, if there is no God, then you have no standard, okay, and no moral obligations. And so I just looked at two of these, the first cause and the moral law. The designer will look at tonight. These arguments are, I think, each of them are great arguments that you can memorize. If you can memorize your home address, you can memorize everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore it has a cause, okay? If you can memorize your phone number, you can memorize the moral argument. Now, let me say one more thing while we close. Just because you offer a good argument for God's existence does not mean that all your friends and all your family members and the strangers on the street, everyone who hears the argument is going to be persuaded. Because there is a difference between proof and persuasion, or evidence and persuasion. The word proof is probably not the best word to use, but it starts with a P, so I'm using it, okay? Proof or evidence, well, that goes to the mind. But the heart, it's a separate issue. The heart, we know, because this is not just an intellectual debate. It's not just an intellectual issue. It's a spiritual issue. And so we also have to pray that God works in the person's heart. You could fill their mind with all kinds of facts and evidence, and that might not change their heart. So don't be discouraged. Be encouraged that you've given a good argument and that God, through the Holy Spirit, can use that to lead that person to a right relationship with God, okay? And so our hope is that the arguments go to the mind and then eventually are used to help change the heart. So always remember, arguments, I don't know who said this, but I didn't come up with it. Arguments can lead an unbeliever to living water, but only the Holy Spirit can make him drink. I thought that was pretty clever, okay? So the arguments, they're not like the silver bullet and, they're going to work every time. But they can work. And if you're here and you're an atheist or an agnostic or you're doubting, I also want to encourage you that there's a bona fide, there's a genuine offer. It's a theme throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament that those who seek after God, truly seek after God, will find him. And of course, these are Jesus' words. He said, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, you will find. Knock, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who knocks, it will be opened. And so I think that's a genuine offer. And so it could be that if you're here and you're an atheist, you just might need to get on your knees and ask God, reveal yourself to me. I heard some arguments today. I don't know if they're true. Can you help me? Make yourself real in my life and see what God does.